We've reached the end. This is the last video recording lecture for Intro to Christian Theology. And it is also the time when we set aside a little time here to talk about the end of all things, or what in Christian theology we call eschatology, the study of the last things. So this lecture is going to be divided into two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about kind of what are the last things? What do we mean when we're talking about the last things? And then the second half, we're going to look at kind of how eschatology and how we talk about eschatology, how we think about eschatology, how that's kind of related to politics in different kinds of ways. There's lots that can be said. I'm going to just take a bit of a selection, if you will, of a few different influential sources. I will probably miss out some. Eschatology is one of those weird things where you can spend a lot of time talking about pretty speculative stuff. And that is the thing with this doctrine. It is wildly speculative. This is the doctrine where we're often talking about things that we don't and can't really know about. But the purpose of this doctrine, well, there's a few purposes for this doctrine. First, there is kind of lingering biblical data, if you will, that we have to account for. So that the Bible talks about things like a final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the kingdom of God, heaven, hell, these various kinds of things, a rapture. There are these kind of references to things that come at the end. And they're not really often all that explained. We could think of Paul very coyly talking about knowing somebody who's taken up into heaven. And I think he's talking about a vision he had. Well, okay, taken up into heaven, sure, because we all know what that's about, right? Or you get these little glimpses from the prophets of being kind of in the heavenly throne room. You think of Isaiah in the throne room of God describing the various kind of cherubim and seraphim attending to God, singing holy, holy, holy. You could think of other prophets standing among the heavenly court, and the implication's almost that the prophet himself is a member of the heavenly court, and he's seeing kind of the various ranks of heaven debating amongst themselves as to what to do about human history, and certain angels coming forward to take on the role of the Shaitan, the Satan, the accuser, who will come and kind of deceive the political leaders of Israel. You see all of these little glimpses and references to things that presumably were part of a much more fully fleshed out social imaginary for the people who wrote these scriptures. But for us, that's all we kind of have is these fragments. And we have Christian traditions around these fragments, but they are kind of incredibly speculative, and we don't really know what to do with them. But I think what we're going to try and arrive at by the end of this lecture is to give you a sense of how even kind of thinking with these fragmentary bits of the tradition, this part of the tradition that is quite strange and can go off in surprisingly weird directions, is actually a helpful area of theological reflection, and is worth considering. And of course, the most stable footing for doing eschatology, like all things, is to kind of consider it within the person and work of Jesus Christ. And so that's where we're going to end up. We're going to take a little bit of time at the very end to look at Catherine Tanner's article that I had you read on a kind of a spatialized eschatology and how she kind of grounds that Christologically in a way that I think is quite helpful. All right. So, we're going to begin with the four last things. In my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning. These famous lines from The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. One might think that he is kind of like referring to a kind of a cyclical account of time, and perhaps he is. He did draw inspiration from various Eastern traditions, but he also was quite a devout Christian, and I think that perhaps he's gesturing to a certain kind of logic that we find in the Christian calendar, which is that at the start of every year, which in the Christian calendar, remember, is Advent, we take some time to consider our end. Why do we do this? Some of you may not have come across this tradition, but it is the older tradition that during the 4 weeks of Advent, we spend time contemplating the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. More modern 20th century kind of interpretations of the Christian calendar have introduced slightly more sentimental themes for Advent, like peace, hope, joy, and love. And sure, those are great, but they kind of don't match up with some of the kind of like biblical themes that we come across in the lectionary at this time. In some ways they do, and in some ways they don't. But I think it's quite important to spend some time at the beginning of the year considering our end. And this is for two reasons. First, there's an ambiguity in English when we talk about end. What do we mean by end? I have here written on the slide, end versus end. We can think of end in two ways. First, the end is kind of the completion of something, right? When it is finally over, the last. And of course, all these things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, these are kind of like final things, final destinations. What happens at the end of a life? Well, you die. And then you face the judgment, and either kind of it's going to work out, you're going to achieve heaven or achieve hell, and that's kind of how she goes. However, there's another way of thinking about the end, and that is in the sense of goal or telos or purpose. What is it that we are kind of oriented towards? As humans, what is our proper end, and how does that relate? So what is our proper purpose? What is our proper goal? And how does that relate to the final things of human existence, right? How does our proper goal of being human, which is probably something to do with, communion with God, relationship with God forever, what does that have to do with the kind of the end of human existence, right? The death of all things, the quite clear teaching we receive from Scripture about facing some kind of final judgment of some sort, and the fairly ubiquitous reference to some sort of place of dwelling, either in my Father's home where there are many rooms, or being cast out into hell or out of outer darkness. So what are these four things? Let's kind of break them down a little bit. Death, who rides a pale horse. We might want to think about death in a couple of different ways. Death is theologically a problem. It's the last enemy to be overcome. It is the wages for sin, right? It is the consequence of the fall from grace, the fall of Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, being cut off from the tree of life. But death is also a kind of a biological fact of human existence, of creaturely existence. To actually sustain human life requires quite an incredible amount of death on a bunch of different levels, right? So we can think of like all the various creaturely deaths entailed in like just the basic consumption of being alive, whether that is plant or animal death. Some kind of death has to kind of like take place for us to be fueled. Secondarily, and this is, you know, something quite outside of the scope or imagination of the biblical writers, but we know that like our own bodies are in a constant state of cellular death and regeneration, right? For like we're constantly shedding dead cells, and as we grow, you know, every bit of us is dying off and being replaced every so often. And so there's a certain like important sense in which death is quite tightly bound up with any living biological process. It's just they are forces that go together always as part of biological existence. So when we talk about death as being a theological problem, are we talking about this order of death that is seems to be like crucial to what it is to be a creature? Perhaps that is a problem, and maybe perhaps that is like one of the fundamental wounds of creatureliness, is that to be creatures means to have death as intimately bound to us as life is. Okay. However, this doesn't seem to be what is in mind when the biblical writers talk about death. They seem to be talking about some sort of a kind of a spiritual death, or a kind of a cutting off from kind of the source of life, capital L. We might think of it. Catherine Tanner spends a bit of time kind of talking about this in her essay. If this kind of like biological death is actually like proper to the human, and actually the only reason why Adam and Eve don't die within a kind of a normal span of human years within their life in the garden, within paradise, is because they have kind of like access to the life of God, right? Kind of a direct access, and whether that is through like kind of eating of the tree of life or the kind of the sustaining power of God, whatever it is, that which is extrinsic to humanity, this kind of like lifefulness is being kind of given to them as pure gift, that is kind of like overwhelming the kind of the natural processes of death that are proper to the creature. So part of like the eviction from Eden, part of the fall, part of this wage of death that comes as a result of sin, is actually a being cut off and being kind of like left to our own devices. So the Lutherans, following Augustine, talk about sin as being what's the Latin? Incurvatur si, I think, being turned in upon oneself. So rather than being kind of like a flower, think of like a sunflower or something, turned outwards to the sun, to the source of all life and energy, rather being kind of like turned in upon oneself, thinking that we have the goods that will like sustain life, and of course we don't. So this is actually what sin is a turning in upon ourselves, looking for that sustaining power of life, and actually that's not proper to humanity. What is where life comes from, the source of all life and goodness and truth, is of course God. And so being cut off from that, or being turned inward away from that, results in this really profound death. And so it's both a kind of a spiritual death, but also then importantly kind of like allows for the normal kind of processes of death that are proper to the creature to kind of like hold sway over us as kind of like the law of being human, right? However, so this is kind of like a way of distinguishing these kind of two orders of death, and perhaps giving a bit of an account of how they might relate to each other. But a new kind of like problem has recently arisen, and I won't spend a ton of time kind of like fleshing this out too much, but just to kind of like draw your attention to it. One of the questions that is being asked right now by theologians is taking seriously this reality that death is so bound up with creatureliness, and that for evolution and evolutionary history to have taken place, which increasingly seems to be just the case, it requires the admission of kind of like mass death in like the course of deep time, right? What evolutionary history represents is kind of like the mass die-off of all sorts of different kinds of species, mass extinction events, entire species going away, being outcompeted, all this kind of stuff, predation being kind of the rule of creatureliness. And also various kind of epochs of climate change, natural climate change and now anthropogenic climate change have resulted in mass extinction periods. And we're living through another such mass extinction period with the climate crisis. So with all this death as being kind of like integral to the order of creation, and what seems to be just descriptively true about creatureliness, some have suggested that this constitutes a theodicy problem, a problem about the justice and goodness of God. If God creates in such a way that mass death and mass extinction is like core to being creaturely, is this a good God or not? And so there's been various attempts to try and kind of articulate this. Some people have found a way of thinking about it within the old paradigm of being a fallen creation, and now death is kind of the rule of the day, and being kind of cut off from that. The result of being cut off from the source of all life and goodness is that this natural order of death is reigning supreme. The problem is, of course, that like if you accept a kind of evolutionary account of human origins, of creaturely origins, then it's highly likely that the creation stories we get in Genesis are not 100% literal, in which case, for all of this to have arisen, everything that is to have arisen just requires a kind of quite a lot of death. So there's not really an easy answer to this question. And this is, in part the moral case that like creationists of various sorts have articulated in their opposition to evolution, what they think is at stake in Christians adopting a kind of a position of theistic evolution. The idea that that God uses normal evolutionary processes to bring about creation. They'll point to something like this as being kind of like a major moral problem, or a major kind of like metaphysical problem about the goodness of God, if God in fact uses these processes. Some attempts to kind of think this through have thought about like maybe distinguishing between different kinds of death as being differently relevant for kind of like spiritual or moral consideration. There's probably limits to that approach, given that once you start kind of like ordering different kinds of death and suffering, you kind of smuggle back in that kind of great chain of being type reasoning that I have railed against in previous lectures, that somehow the suffering of a squirrel is not as worthy of consideration as a more sophisticated animal like a dolphin or a human. why should that be the case, right? So anyways, this is a lot. I recognize that I'm probably introducing more doubts and questions than I am answers here, but these are some of the kind of the questions that are being thought about around the problem of death today. A little bit different than just kind of articulating. So you had a kind of an earlier picture of death, that death was just the problem, just kind of a wage of sin. And so the problem to be solved is the problem of death. Modern science comes along, says, well, death is kind of like part of the biological facts of creatureliness. Okay, well, here's a way of articulating how when we think about death as a like problematic death versus kind of like death as a normal part of creatureliness, there is a way to distinguish these two things. But now a third subsequent problem has arisen in kind of the consideration of deep time and evolutionary history and mass extinction events. How is all of this creaturely death that is kind of seems to be inherent to what it is to be a creature? How does that square with an all good and all powerful God? And I will let you contemplate that, because frankly I don't have satisfying answers around that. All right. Following from death comes judgment. The Roman Catholic Catechism says that the Most Holy Roman Church believes and confesses firmly that on the day of judgment, all people will appear together with their own bodies before the judgment seat of Christ to render an account of their works. I've included here is the image, the story of the sheep and the goats. This parable that Jesus tells about all people coming before him and being separated out as either sheep or goats, those who, followed Christ, obeyed Christ's command, and those who did not for various reasons, and they're separated. You also get an image in Scripture of the wheat and the tares being separated out, tares being burned and the wheat being part of the good harvest. Where is this coming from? Well, there is this deep logic to this that Jesus is playing with. So it sounds like, Jesus, why are you being so judgy? Well, he's actually just very consistent with what the Hebrew Bible has always taught. Here's a bit of a sidebar. Sometimes people like to kind of say, I've tried to emphasize throughout this class that the God of the Old Testament simply is the God of the New Testament and is the same God, the God that we see at work in Jesus Christ is the God we see at work raising Israel out of Egypt. Lots of times, though, there's a kind of a laziness in reading Scripture where people say, oh, the God of the Old Testament, so mean, so evil, so bad. We don't like that God. What we like is the New Testament God. But, actually just pay attention to the Gospels and you will see that Jesus is actually, kind of harsh sometimes. Actually, not necessarily better, quote unquote, than the God we see revealed in the Old Testament. So if your standard for what parts of the Bible equal the real God is kind of driven by which God is nice, you're gonna be hard pressed to find a God that you like kind of anywhere you turn. All right, sidebar over. In Deuteronomy, you get this kind of basic theology of if you follow the commandments of God, you will have blessings and long life in the land. If you don't, you will have curses. Ecclesiastes comes along and points out basically the absurdity of this, that we often see the wicked prospering and the righteous suffering. And this seems to not at all follow from the kind of the covenantal theology you see in Deuteronomy. I am increasingly of the opinion that to understand how Jesus is appropriating the Hebrew scriptures in his teaching, it's really important to actually read. So anytime you think that Jesus is making an allusion to the Old Testament, and that happens all the time in the Gospels, it's probably helpful to see how it's being kind of read through the lens of Ecclesiastes. Because I think actually this is often what's going on. Now at the very end of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 12, there is a passage that says, fear God and follow the commandments, for this is the all of Adam. In your English translations, it might say this is the whole duty of man or something like that. But in Hebrew, it's just this is the all of Adam, of the human. This is all there is to being human, is to fear God and follow the commands. This is what we see. So what's going on here, and which is why I think Jesus is constantly kind of like appropriating the rest of the Hebrew Bible through the book of Ecclesiastes, is that so much of the Hebrew Bible is kind of like filtered through the Mosaic covenant and the Mosaic law. But there are these kind of like points of tension in the Mosaic covenant where like there's things missing, right? Like, or the Abrahamic covenant. There are people missing from that covenant. The scope of it is narrow. There are things that don't seem to quite actually mesh up with reality, such as the incommensurability of our experience of seeing the absolute worst people do well and the absolute best people suffer. That is kind of like incommensurable with how the scriptures kind of say things should go. And I think Ecclesiastes is very kind of like attentive to that. And what it does is it actually points back behind the Mosaic covenants, behind the Abrahamic covenant, and points to the covenant of creation, which isn't kind of within like covenantal reasoning. It's not really often properly considered a covenant per se, but I think often what we see Jesus doing and Paul doing is pointing back to creation as being this kind of like universal covenant with everybody. And this is the kind of the logic by which Christianity is able to offer this universal message to all, is that it's kind of like grounded in creation. And in the covenant of creation, when God creates the Adam, the human, he's given kind of commandments, and that's all that they are to do, is just to fear God and follow that simple commandment to just not eat this particular fruit. There's not like judgment is not needed. What is needed is kind of like a kind of holy fear and obedience. But what is opted for instead is rather than, and this is going to be like a radical reliance on God and God's holiness and God's perfection for kind of the source of life and goodness and all things. Instead, we opt for ourselves to be kind of the source of our own life, the center of everything, that we can determine good and evil, even though evil is inherently irrational, not something that we can actually determine. And as a result, everything becomes, in the word of Koheleth, hevel, vanity, merest breath, a chasing after the wind, something that is passing away and vexing to the human. So this becomes kind of human existence under the conditions of kind of fallen existence, is that we live in this kind of like hevel situation. Nevertheless, what is proper to being human, what is the all of being human, is fearing God and obeying God's commands. Uh, for those of you who attended a Maundy Thursday service this past week, you would have heard Maundy coming from the Latin mandatum for commandment, so named because the scripture reading is from John 13, a new command I give you, to love one another. This is what it is to fear God and follow God's command, is to love one another in the end. And when we get to these depictions of judgment in the Gospels, what we have are, the goats, on the one hand, being depicted as kind of in these this profound lack of charity, right? Like not taking in the widow and the orphan, not caring for the prisoner, not giving the hungry something to eat. Just the basic demands of solidarity for our brothers and sisters in humanity, just kind of failing to do that. Instead being kind of turned in upon ourselves, and as a result, becoming enemies to one another and to ourselves, making ourselves wretched. And this is all judged. But the question is not so much what is the outcome of this judgment, because as we've talked about elsewhere, one of the acts, the mighty saving acts of God, is to kind of be both the judge and the judged one in our place, to take on the wounds that we inflict upon ourselves, to take those upon his own body, that we might be made well. But the question for this doctrine, for the doctrine of eschatology, that we might want to consider is kind of, when does this occur? So for some people, and this is kind of the way I was raised, and you'll hear people articulating this a lot in kind of like pastoral situations, which I'm not actually sure is entirely helpful. But you'll hear people saying, that this kind of judgment almost happens kind of immediately. So immediately upon dying, you're kind of like judged by God, and the determination is made, heaven or hell. And so you hear a lot of people comforting people who've experienced death or loss, that your loved one today is in heaven, is in paradise. And this comes from proof texts like when Jesus is on the cross, and the man in his side, the one man is mocking him, the other man is trying to defend him, and Jesus leans over and says, truly today you will be with me in paradise. This, by implication, being that like immediately upon death you'll be taken into the paradise of God, and you'll receive your reward. You also get like depictions, the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is this poor man who, begged outside of the rich man's house. For a long time, and when they both die, the poor man, the beggar, goes to Abraham's bosom, to heaven, and the rich man goes down to hell, and is kind of like, oh man, this is so bad. Please let me like go back and warn my family how bad this stuff is, and how should have been more like Lazarus and all this stuff. And he's told, well, they have the law and the prophets, and that should be enough for them. So there's this one kind of account of this where this kind of stuff happens immediately. Now, that can be like really helpful pastorally for people, but I think the majority tradition holds to some kind of like final day of judgment. That there's some sort of last day, this idea of like the trump being sounded and the dead being raised. And it's almost as if the position where the dead are now is that they are kind of just in the grave. That's actually where the dead are. And they're waiting a final day, at which point a final judgment will be made. And that's the point at which sheep and the goats will be separated out. That's the point at which, the righteous will go to their reward in heaven, and the damned to hell. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, partly it is this bit from the Catechism here about all men will appear together with their own bodies before the judgment seat of Christ. We talked, was it last week, where we talked about theological anthropology, about it seems to be that part of being human is always to be embodied, that we always have some kind of a body that is like part of being a human creature, and that doesn't actually like stop in in the resurrection life. And so it seems to be the case that, at least in like Israelite religion, there became a belief by the time of Jesus that there would be a general resurrection of the dead, and that's when the judgment would happen. And so you're facing either eternity with God or eternity in hell as an embodied reality, not as a kind of a spiritual reality. That it's not something that just our spirits experience, but something that we experience in our bodies. And what kind of bodies those are, well, that becomes a really interesting question, right? The Origen thought that we all were resurrected in kind of perfect spherical form. The New Testament imagines, well, we get, a depiction of Jesus' body as being having all sorts of kind of strange properties, like the ability to appear in different rooms suddenly, go pass through walls seemingly, go unrecognized if need be, but also be able to eat and also bear wounds. The wounds of this life, they're healed, but they're still there. They still leave scars. So there's some sort of continuity and radical discontinuity between whatever our embodied existence is now and whatever it will be. The resurrection body is importantly something different, but not so different that it lacks any continuity to our embodied existence now. And this has shaped all sorts of things in Christian kind of piety, particularly around the burial of the dead. By and large, it hasn't been a Christian practice to burn our dead. We typically bury the dead for the purpose of being kind of like raised bodily. But some of this gets a little wonky sometimes. If you died as a result of suicide or were put to death for heresy or something like that, sometimes they would bury people in a way that they thought would prevent them from being resurrected. So either face down, so that when the resurrection came and Jesus, allegedly grabs everybody by the right hand and pulls them up out of the grave, well, if they're buried face down or with the left hand on top or something like this, then they wouldn't be raised. They would just be left there. I mean, that it seems kind of silly, but it's also a kind of like, it demonstrates a way in which Christian speculation about the final things, in this case being kind of the final judgment and the resurrection of the dead as an embodied reality, shaped certain material practices and set certain kinds of like social and cultural taboos around certain kinds of behaviors by the way they buried their dead, right? If you didn't die in kind of certain illicit ways, then your body was kind of prepared in such a way that it became impossible to be resurrected. Obviously, we might want to say that even that's not impossible for God. And that surely if bodies that have seen the decay of the tomb for thousands of years can be resurrected, then so too can those that have been burned by fire or those that have been lost at sea or whatever, right? If the sea can give up its dead, if the grave can give up its dead, surely the powers of flame can't withhold their dead either. But Christians throughout history have thought different things about this, and it has kind of like had these certain kinds of political ramifications. All right, heaven. What is heaven? My wife gets freaked out about heaven because she thinks, how boring must it be to just kind of like be alive forever? No matter how nice it could be, that sounds kind of like terrifying to her. Valid. What is heaven? Well, we get a bunch of fragmentary descriptions of heaven, and they are not consistent with one another. We get this description of it being Abraham's bosom, whatever that is, I don't know. We get this idea of it being kind of the dwelling place of God. Heaven is your throne and the earth is your footstool. It's where the heavenly court is. It's where the presence of the Lord is. It's where angels come from, bringing messages from God to earth. It's where the Father has his mansion that has these so many rooms in it that Jesus goes to prepare a place for us in. It seems to be a place of some sort of eternal reward where we receive crowns for the sake of our suffering and our righteousness. It seems to be the place where every tear is dried and every wound is healed. Some have asked, though, what things that we experience as woundedness are in fact wounds that heal? This question has been pressed particularly by disability theologians. Amos Young writes about his brother with Down syndrome who asked, people say that when I go to heaven, I will be healed of this, of my Down syndrome, and I won't have it anymore. But how then will people know who I am? My Down syndrome's not something that is a defect. It is who I am. And who could I possibly be apart from it? Is this the kind of thing that is healed in heaven, or is this not? And how does that reconfigure how we consider what is woundedness and what is part of the expanse of creaturely flourishing today? Our society increasingly considers Down syndrome a profound disability that should be ruthlessly exterminated prior to persons with it being born. And yet, here we have people who actually have Down syndrome saying, I don't think that this is something that needs healing in heaven. So where does that leave us? Heaven is described as something that is passing away. That there will be a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem that comes down from the new heaven to the new earth. It is the highest place. It is the place that is above every place. I once went to a church that was in the middle of preaching the most ridiculous sermon series on heaven and decided, this is almost too unbelievably stupid to repeat, but decided from some esoteric reading of the Psalms that in fact the universe is encased in a sphere of water, the waters above, and that upon the top of the waters God had reached into creation, taken cedars from creation and built heaven atop of the waters. Um, well, for starters, the universe does not have a top. It doesn't have a bottom. This is just a profoundly silly thing to say, but we could maybe excuse this pastor for getting these things wrong because, well, the scriptures do use this kind of language, partially because for Israelite cosmology, what you basically have is like the earth, you have the waters below, you have the waters above that do kind of create this kind of like dome almost. And then affixed to that is the firmament of the heavens, and then like the stars and stuff are like stuck to this firmament, and then the air is in between, like the sky is in between that, and the earth, and then we live on the earth, and yeah, so you get this kind of like this picture of almost like a kind of a snow globe universe is kind of how if you see kind of like graphic representations of how kind of Israelites imagined the world, we just again, we know that that's not actually how the universe is structured. So it would be kind of profoundly silly to kind of like think of, or like to try and take a hyper literal reading of this poetic language in the Psalms and say that this is exactly what heaven is like. However, all we have to kind of like get at the reality of heaven is all this like highly metaphorical and symbolic language. Now, one thing that's like quite interesting about the way heaven is depicted is kind of like a heavenly city that has a lot of the features of the Garden of Eden, right? Like has these rivers, has these trees, has this kind of stuff that we remember from Eden. And one of like the profound things that people have commented on is that how interesting that just as like creation starts in a garden and kind of like progresses towards a city, and like cities that are full of all sorts of crime and exploitation. Well, heaven also seems to culminate in a city that is free of all of the things that our cities are plagued by, right? So there's almost this kind of contrastive element to heaven that like it is what if creation had like progressed into its fullness? That seems to be like heaven is the contingent possibility of what could have been otherwise, that instead has been kind of like tainted and ruined by sin and the fall. Another like thing that you will hear mostly certain kinds of Roman Catholics and some Eastern Orthodox talk about is, and the occasional like Anglo-Catholic Anglican, they'll talk about the beatific vision. This again, well, it has to do with what it refers to is like our ability to kind of like see God without kind of like layers of mediation, that like a fully sanctified life is able to kind of like behold God as God truly is. Now, there's versions of this that is kind of like we become almost like the angels, like pure kind of like intellects, pure mind that is able to kind of like see God rightly. And those kind of versions of the beatific vision have us kind of being like wholly absorbed into the divine life, disembodied, and I don't think that's probably the way we should go given all of the other emphasis on our embodied existence. But some kind of version of the beatific vision where we see and know God fully and truly, even as we maintain our kind of like creaturely distinctiveness, and our embodied reality as human creatures, is quite worth thinking about, because it makes us ask what needs to be purified about the human condition in order to kind of like know God fully, even as we are fully known by God. All right. All right. To finish off here, let's talk about hell. This is the famous painting by Hieronymus Bosch of hell. One of the things that, or like, one of the things that's distinctive about this painting is the kind of like the frantic, frenetic energy and movement and chaos of it. That everything is like loud and moving about quickly, and that's contrasted with kind of like these kind of classical notions of heaven as being kind of like serene, still, peaceful, that kind of thing. In other words, and this is where some wind up thinking, "Oh, heaven sounds boring," and hell sounds like it's a lot of fun. But this does not look fun to me. It looks like chaos, pure chaos, pandemonium. Hell. We borrow a lot of ideas of hell from kind of Greek religion, like Tartarus. Really kind of like influences how we think about hell as this kind of place where specific individual tortures are meted out to people. That's not really a biblical kind of thing. It's more kind of borrowed from kind of Greek concepts. In the Bible, you get talk of Sheol, the grave. This, at least in a lot of instances of it, just seems to be not actually like hell per se as in terms of like a place of punishment, but rather hell or like the grave as just kind of a place, the place of the dead, where the dead go. And so there's this tradition in Christianity of like the harrowing of hell. Christ descends to hell to set free the captives there. Now, who are the captives? The tradition is that from the time of Adam to the time of Noah, there's no covenant in place, no saving covenant for humankind. And so all the people in that period in between, they're like caught in hell. And so when Christ descends there, he's like ministering to those spirits there. And some traditions say like, he preaches to them, and it's those who accept the gospel there that are then free to leave. Others would say no, Jesus harrows hell, like he comes in on a war horse, smashes all the chains, leaves the gates careening, broken, and like leads everybody out of hell, leads everybody out of the grave. It smashes the power of the place, and so hell still exists as a place, but the gates are broken, and anybody and everybody's free to leave at any time. Again, in this tradition, it seems to be more kind of associated with just this is the place of the dead, not necessarily a place of torture. This idea of like a place of torture kind of seems to come from like this idea of Gehenna, this burning lake, or the place of outer darkness. Gehenna was a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. Seems to be the metaphor here. Yeah, it is like held up as this contrastive thing to entering into paradise, entering into your full reward of righteousness in heaven. There is this alternate place to end up. Now, this place is said to have been kind of like prepared specifically for Satan and his followers, that it's not actually prepared for humans. And yet, the kind of the impossible possibility is that some humans have like so chosen damnation that they too get sent to this place that properly prepared for Satan, and like as a place of punishment for Satan and his followers. It is just like part of scripture. It is as far as I know, a doctrine of the church. However, you have this counter story of Jesus kind of like raiding hell, smashing its power, and making it so that like staying there is not something that you kind of have to do. So there is this like asterisk beside the reality of hell. I think it would be too much to say that hell, from a kind of like Orthodox Christian perspective, it's too much to say that hell does not exist. However, it is not too much to say, and it's not too much to hope that hell is not, as Hieronymus Bosch depicts it, full of people being tortured for their sins, but rather is a place that's quite quiet and empty now. And that those who are left are there by choice and actually are still free to leave at any time. You see a version of something like this in C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle. The dwarves are sitting in this... they think that they're sitting in this barn, and all they can see is hay and dung and darkness, and they're just convinced that that's where they are. Turns out, though, that they're actually not, that they're actually just like in a meadow in Aslan's country, and it's just like a constant conscious willing on their part to kind of maintain their own prison that keeps them there, that stops them from going further in, higher up and further in, as the language of that book talks about, as what it is like to kind of live in Aslan's country, to live in this kind of like heavenly place, is to go further into the goodness of reality, but rather the tragic nature of kind of creature existence is that some people can get like so ensnared in their own kind of like delusions of damnation that they're held there almost by their own volition. So anyways, we cannot know what the ultimate status of heaven or hell will be. But hell is often used as a cudgel by Christians, as a threat for bad behavior. And sometimes I'm not sure that that's entirely a bad thing. There is a whole very holy tradition of using the threat of hell to hold accountable those with too much power and too much money. That, yes, we cannot do anything about the king. We cannot do anything about the billionaires. But there is one who can, and if they don't take seriously the plight of the poor now, well, they might just end up like that rich man while Lazarus is in heaven and they are... they've already received their reward now. And so there was a time where the church would remind kings every so often that actually they needed the prayers of the poor if they did not want to end up in hell. Maybe that's not the worst thing. Maybe we've lost something as a society by not remembering that. I could think of a few billionaires who could maybe learn to fear God again. However, we also have this just incredible note of grace that runs through all of Christian theology, that leaves open the possibility that we might hope that this place is ultimately empty. Maybe there are some people who are a bit too stubborn, who need to spend a bit of time in a place like this. But if the gates are broken and nobody's keeping there, the jailers are gone, perhaps even the most obstinate of sinner might yet be saved. All right, let's take a break.